welcome to another edition of Women in the Fore. With me is Elina Kamaliza. This is a program that we look at the lives of different women and how they've made it in their own ways being leaders. And in today's program, I'm joined by Dr. Mary Mkandawire. She's a leadership consultant, executive coach, and corporate trainer. Welcome to the program, Doctor.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wow, wonderful. To start off, who is Dr. Mary Mkandawire?
You know, that question, when I saw it, I was like, where do I even begin? But I'll begin with something that's really close to my heart. And the thing that really defines me is my relationship with God through Jesus as my Savior and Lord. I mean, that's the filter through which I make all the decisions and choices in my life and the direction of my life. Yeah.
What was life like growing up, being a young girl? Tell us about that.
Wow. Okay. So I did grow up with a very privileged background. My father was Mr. Bridger Katenga. He was one of the first ambassadors when Malawi first gained independence from Great Britain. And so I grew up traveling, basically. I was born in Ethiopia, and then from there we went to the US, then to Germany, then to the UK, then to Nairobi, and then back to Malawi. So essentially, by the time I was 10, I'd lived in 6 countries on 3 continents. So it was a very privileged background, but everything changed for us when I was about 10 years of age, because that's when my dad died in a fatal car accident. And literally our whole lives changed. So my mom had to go back to her profession as a nurse. And when my dad died, we'd been living in Area 10, but the house came with the job, so we had to move. So fortunately, my mom got a job at Malawi Railways dispensary. At the time, that meant we moved from Lilongwe to Limbi, Quarter India. And that was a huge shock for us, because growing up in the embassy, being in Area 10, and then going to a high density area, that was very difficult. And I remember my mom was very open with us. She shared that her salary at that time was 100 kwacha, which, I mean, back then, like a loaf of bread was something like 10 tabala. So it was in line with salaries at that time, but when there were 7 of us, you know, for her to clothe and feed. Yeah, so that was very difficult. But she kept us in our international schools where we were at the time, because our parents, fortunately, they had 2 properties which kept us in our schools. And so that was essentially it.
So where did you go to school? Mix the traveling that you had to go all around the world in your primary school years. What was it like going through your education?
Well, primary school, so I was in different countries, obviously, until we came here. So I did my Standard 4 and Standard 5 at St. Andrews International Primary. Standard 6 was at Hillview, and then I was at St. Andrews International High School, and I did my A-levels at KA. We were the first group to start KA in 1981, and I was the first head girl of KA. Sure.
So what was it like, a new school and being the first cohort and also being the first head girl at the Kamuza Academy? What did that feel like?
I mean, I was excited to be there, because at that time we were actually, to join KA, you had to be selected and you had to be in part of the system. And I was outside the system because I was in a private school. So I literally had to apply to go to Kamuza Academy, and I had to go for an interview. And initially they were saying, no, we can't really accept you because you're outside the system. But when I went for an interview and I was accepted, I think there was only 2 of us who were from outside the system, and we were the only ones who had to pay school fees. We paid about 100 kwacha per year or something like that. So I was really excited to be there. And it was a good experience.
How did your career then grow from there? From Kamuza Academy, going to college, what was it like?
So from career, I don't know about you, but when it came time to choose a career, I didn't have any clue what I wanted to do. It seemed everybody else was really confident. They knew what they wanted to do, engineering, whatever. But for me, I had an interesting problem, because I was a good student and I enjoyed every subject, humanities, sciences, the arts. But I went into science and medicine as a status kind of thing, because there weren't many women in science, weren't many women doctors. And in my family, I had a sister 3 years older than I am, who'd just gone to medical school. So I was like, we won't just be 1 woman doctor in the family, but we're going to have 2. So I went and did medicine, but it seemed like I wasn't quite on the same wavelength as everybody else when I was in medical school. I was always more interested in the whole person rather than just the physical condition that had brought them to medical school. which is why I kind of find myself where I am today, on a different path.
Yeah. When you discovered that and you went through medical school, what was it like when you shared it perhaps with your family? How did they take that?
I didn't really share at that time what I was going through, because there was an incident that happened while I was right there in medical school. There was one incident that always sticks out in my mind, and happened in surgery. And I'm married to a surgeon, but I had a really bad experience while I was in medical school with a surgeon. And it was an elderly lady had come into hospital with a broken hip, and she was very worried. This was while I was in London. She was very worried because she stayed alone with her cat, and with that injury, she was going to be in hospital for a long time. So I took a lot of information about just her social circumstances and who she was. And so I presented this at the morning meeting. We have a handover meeting where you have senior consultant right down to us medical students who are right at the end. And I presented all the information about this lady. And the consultant, he looked at me and he said, you know, let the social workers deal with the social work. We are surgeons. So I remember from then on, I kind of squashed that part of me and said, okay, let me just do what medical students do. And I kind of ignored that part for a while.
So now taking up becoming a leadership coach, a trainer, what was the journey like to becoming one that you are?
So after I did my first degree, I went on and I did public health. I did my master's degree in public health at University of Liverpool. Came back to Malawi, and I was working at, then it was Malaria Project. Now I think it's been absorbed into the Wellcome Trust. And I was doing research, malaria research, HIV/AIDS research. But my particular project, at that time, Fancida was becoming resistant. So we were looking for an alternative treatment. And I was based out at Ndirande Health Center. And so as part of our research, initially we'd take participants, mothers would bring their children to the health center, and we test, did they have malaria parasites? Then we just give them the usual Fancida treatment, and then send them away and tell them to come back for follow-up after a couple of weeks. If they didn't come back, then we had to follow them up to see, did they get better? Did they unfortunately pass away, or what had happened? And so that was an eye-opener for me, because that was the first time I'd actually been into the heart of Ndirande. I'm not talking about like new lines, but I'm talking about the real Ndirande, So we'd leave the health center in our huge white Pajero, going down these dirt roads which are so narrow, and there are things on either side, people, you know, all sorts of goods, and eventually this dirt road comes to an end, and we have to get out of our Pajero. And if you know anything about malaria season, it's the rainy season. So we're now stepping out into... If it was just water, that would be okay. But there are all sorts of unidentified debris and no idea. So going through in between, we call them houses, but they were just like shacks made out of all sorts of constructions, mud bricks, different kinds of things. And I'm going there and seeing these patients of mine living in a one-room shack, family, extended family, everybody's in here. There's nowhere where they can dispose of their waste, or there's no running water. And it wasn't just that, you know, coming from the UK, coming back here, you know, in the UK we had these nice state-of-the-art hospitals, but then we're coming back. I was in Queens. We were reusing gloves that are supposed to be disposable. We were reusing them. We'd write prescriptions for the pharmacy, knowing only too well that there are no drugs there. And just different things. Even in the districts, we found women and children dying unnecessarily in childbirth because there was no transport, no communication. And I thought all these things are impacting my ability to do my best work as a doctor, but they're actually outside my remit as a doctor. They're even outside the health sector. They're actually issues to do with leadership. And that's when I decided to go into leadership development. Yes.
Being one woman that is so driven, I'd put it that way, now you're already a doctor. One would feel content that, okay, I have a medical degree, I've also done my master's degree in public health. I'm quite satisfied with where I am. What would you say about one discovering their true passions and going for it?
It's funny you say that I was satisfied. I wasn't actually satisfied. And it's like outwardly you can look successful, but inwardly there was a whole lot going on inside me that, you know, you asked what it was like growing up. It looked very glamorous, you know, traveling from one country to the next. But because of that, I kind of grew up not knowing where I belonged, because when you're overseas, you don't belong. You look different. Your skin is different. Your hair is different. Your nose is different. Your name, people can't pronounce your name. Coming back to Malawi, it was supposed to be home. But as a 10-year-old kid, I remember opening my mouth and all the other kids laughing because of the way I was pronouncing the local language, and grown-ups scolding me because I didn't know the language, didn't know the culture. So I always felt, where do I belong? And as I expressed before, when it came to career, I didn't quite know what to choose. And also in terms of my personality as well, I'm more of the quiet kind of people. So when I was growing up, people would always ask me, why aren't you speaking? Why are you always reading? And I think, what's wrong with me? I need to be speaking. And so it was always as I was going through life, I always had a sense of, I don't quite fit in, I don't quite belong, I didn't know quite who I was and what I wanted out of life. And it was only when I was actually doing my master's degree in public health, I had a transformational experience that it kind of set me on the path even before I hit Indira, and I was already sort of on that path. And there were two incidences that happened. So while we were there doing my master's degree in public health, we're sitting around the table having class discussions. And one of the students, as usual, people are speaking and I'm being my usual self, not saying much. So one of the other students confronted me and she said, "Mary, why aren't you saying anything? You should be speaking. You never say anything." And before I could even think to say anything, another of the students around the table said, "Mary might not say much, but when she does, you'd better listen because it's usually important." And I was stunned. And then at the same time, I was doing a lot of work in my local church, working quite closely with my pastor. There were lots of projects that we did in the community for the young, for the elderly, for the disadvantaged. And so we're having a dinner, I think Christmas dinner at his house, and everyone's around the table having fun, chatting. And I'm being my usual Mary self, just enjoying the conversation, listening to people, laughing at their jokes. And again, somebody says, "Mary, you don't say much, do you?" And before I could respond again, my pastor said, "Leave Mary alone. She's a thinker." And I tell you, that was for the first time in my life, I felt affirmed. I felt like, qualities which I had thought had no value, all of a sudden had value. And so I said, if these qualities, which I've always thought all my life were useless, had no value, what else is there about myself that I'm missing? And so I started on a journey of self-development, personal development, finding out more about myself. And that's when I discovered sort of where I'm more suited. And it wasn't really to be a medical doctor in the hospital, being a clinician, but what I'm doing now is perfectly suited to the way that God created me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
We'll take a short break. We are talking to Dr. Mary Mkandawire. She is a leadership consultant, executive coach, and a corporate trainer. We're hearing more about her life and how she got to where she is now. Stay tuned as we continue with the program shortly. Continuing with the program Women in the Fore, I am Zelina Kamaliza, and in today's program we're talking to Dr. Mary Mkandawire. She's a leadership consultant, executive coach, and corporate trainer. Continuing with our chat, Dr. Mary, now that you went into discovering yourself and helping other people also discover themselves, what has it been like over the years?
I really love the way that you've put that, because that essentially is what I do. I know I describe myself as a leadership consultant, executive coach, corporate trainer, but essentially what I'm all about is helping people discover their purpose in life, discover that what makes them unique, because what I always tell them is that what makes you unique makes you successful. Too often people are living their lives according to other people's expectations, what society expects of them, even expectations that they have of themselves that aren't quite in line with the way that they were created. And it really is fulfilling when you see people who have been going through life. I remember there's one client that I had who was a very successful woman, outwardly looking very successful. And when we had our first meeting, she said, when people look at me, they see, I have the car, the house, the job, the status, everything. But every time I drive up to those gates I walk into that office, I sit at that desk, my heart sinks, and I think, there has to be more to life than this. And this is someone who looked really successful. And so when I took her through my process, I've now actually made it into a course. It's called Leading with Your Authentic Competitive Edge. And so when I took her through that course, it was nice seeing just the light bulbs go off in her head, and the joy and the transformation that she went into. And she left her corporate, like, high-flying career and really took a leap of faith into a totally different direction. But she landed on her feet, and she's now doing what it is that she was created to do. And that's what, brings me joy. That's really fulfilling. Yeah.
When you look at the Malawian woman, since you came back home and really adapted to life in Malawi, where is it that we are lacking for us to really discover our purpose and not just look at having life, as you're saying, that we have cars, we have homes, but really living a life of purpose?
Sometimes it is just exposure to the possibilities that are out there. I was privileged because I've traveled even as an adult with my education and work. I've traveled a lot. I think with exposure, when you see what's out there, what the different possibilities are. Like now, I do a lot of just going into schools, career guidance, mentoring, speaking in schools. And when you go, especially into the more rural schools, when I go in and I'm introduced as doctor, it's wonderful just to see the eyes of the girls light up, because it's like, you mean it's possible for a woman to be a doctor? So it's just what are we exposed to? What do we know? What are the possibilities of what's out there? So I think a lot of that, that contributes a lot to what, the choices that we make.
Being a leadership consultant and executive coach, it's quite a unique business, if I'm be allowed to put it in that way, because it's not out there everywhere in Malawi where you'd say, I'll find a leadership consultant and they will lead me through how I can do my work better or be a better leader. How is it like establishing yourself, and what's the market like in Malawi?
Yeah, you're right. When I first started, because I started in 2012, that's when I started as doing what I'm doing today. And at that time, in fact, there weren't any Malawian coaches. There's my colleague who we spoke about earlier. She had qualified as a coach, but she was actually based in Nairobi at the time. So when I started, I didn't even know of any other Malawian coaches in the country. So it was really a matter of sensitizing people, because even the organizations that do have a coaching culture, mainly like multinationals, they were getting their coaches from outside, like mainly South Africa. So I really it was a matter of letting people know that here I am, I'm available, and just sensitizing people that what is coaching and what is the value. And and my main clients initially for coaching were expatriates who are based in Malawi rather than local indigenous, as well as organizations like the Women in News, international organizations who are trying to build capacity for leaders within the country. So those were my main clients initially. But as it's grown, and it is growing now, and we're seeing more people are entering the market, so it's great.
What would you say about women? Maybe they might not afford one professional coach, but having someone to talk to or a mentor, how important is that in one's life?
I'm actually going to take you up on what you said about not being able to afford a coach. Sometimes I think people, do you know how much even a coach costs? Sometimes people, they're afraid even to go there. But I don't think we should be afraid of what the costs are, because sometimes the cost of not developing yourself is even more, because you don't know what you don't know. And when you have a coach, they help you to be able to draw out that potential within you. So for me, the cost of actually not having a coach is much higher, because without a coach, it's very difficult for you to reach your potential. And it is also important to have mentors, because that can really speed up your success, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's easier, they say success leaves clues. So it's much easier to learn from somebody else's mistakes, learn from somebody else's journey, their path. You're not going to follow it exactly, but you can learn from them, and you don't have to make the same mistakes. You can get clues as to, what is it that helps people to be successful. So the cost of not having a coach is actually higher, and it is important to have one.
All right. Would you mind sharing any of the challenges that you ever faced in your journey? Did you ever get to a point where you felt like, okay, I can't go on from this, maybe I just leave it?
I did, but it's probably not what you think, because when I started discovering more about myself and what it is that I want out of life, one thing that I discovered is also with my values, one thing that I discovered is that I really wanted to spend time with my daughter in her formative years. So I took that decision for 10 years, between 2002 and 2012, while she was in like primary school, high school. I took that decision to actually step out of formal work, and I was, you could say, a stay-at-home mom, but I was also doing lots of projects with young people at that time. So, because I knew I wanted to develop leaders, but I said, let me develop while they're small, so that I can also spend that time with my daughter. And that was really challenging because of the pressure from society. People couldn't understand. They're like, you're a whole doctor, you have 4 degrees, you're just sitting at home looking after this child. And there was lots of condemnation and just lots of judgment because of the decision that I had made. Whereas I knew the vision that I had for my life, I knew where it was that I wanted to go. But in that moment, there was a lot of pressure. And at one point, I did actually go back into we call CPD, Continuing Professional Development, to keep up my registration with the Medical Council. And I did that for about 6 months, and I was going to go back into practicing clinical medicine. But then I was like, you know what, I can't do that. So that was what nearly made me stop this journey. Just the pressure, and also not just external, pressure within myself. As you see your colleagues who you went to medical school with, they're progressing with their careers and they're becoming professor so-and-so, and you're like, hey, am I missing out? Did I should
go back.
Yeah, did I make the right choice? But where I am now, I'm like, yeah, it was the right choice for sure.
What would you want to see for the young girls in Malawi, coming from the rural parts? Where would you want to see these girls be, and for them to understand that they have it within themselves?
Yeah, for them, especially the rural, there's just so much. They have so much potential, but they're facing so many obstacles at the moment. I mean, just culturally, but even without going to the culture, just in terms of education. If you're sitting under a tree, trying to be educated, you don't have the proper things that you need to study. When it's raining, you can't study because you're under this tree. You're 100 people being taught by one teacher. Just that in itself, for you just to actually get the baseline of a good education, is such a challenge for boys and girls. But then for girls, then we talk about the feminine things that happen to us, feminine hygiene when you're in your period, the challenge of dealing with that when you're a rural girl. So our rural girls have so many challenges, even before you start thinking about drawing out their potential. There's so many things, obstacles that they have to overcome.
There are so many initiatives, I should say, that are trying to empower girls from different organizations, individuals that are going out there. What more would you love to see from these things that would really help girls?
For me, I would say, like, from my standpoint, because everything that has helped me to be where I am today is understanding who I am, and that came primarily from my relationship with God. And sometimes I see initiatives that are just taking bits and pieces, but if you don't have that foundation, to me, from my worldview, from my standpoint, it's impossible for you even to reach your potential if you don't have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. That has to be the foundation, because it was only then, because He's the one who made us. He's the one who created us. I like my favorite verses in Psalm 139, verses between 13 to 16, where it says, every one of our days are written in His book before one of them came about. So He's the one who made us. He's the one who created us. And if we're not connected to God, it's actually impossible for us to reach our potential.
As we are winding up our chat, would you share some of your achievements, ones that come to your mind so quickly and say, this is the best thing I got?
I like to be number one. I like to be the first. So I was the first head girl at KA. I was the first woman in the first group of doctors to graduate from College of Medicine. There were 11 of us. I was the only woman in that group. I was the first woman. I'm certified by Dr. John Maxwell, who's one of the leading authorities in leadership world over. I was the first Malawian to be on the John Maxwell team. So those are